Hello, and welcome to Book Dreams, the podcast for everyone who loves books and has ever wondered about them. I'm Julie Sternberg, author of a number of children's books, including Like Pickle Juice on a Cookie and its sequels.
And I'm Eve Yohalem, also a children's book author. My books include The Truth According to Blue, which is coming out May 12, and Cast Off, The Strange Adventures of Petra de Winter and Bram Broen. In each episode of this podcast, we explore a book-related musing, something we've been dying to know. In this episode of Book Dreams, we want to know, how does the original version of Little Women compare to the version that we grew up reading, and that our parents grew up reading, and our grandparents and great-grandparents grew up reading? Because it turns out we did not grow up reading the original version.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of an origin story for us. We were trying to decide what our podcast should be about, and we decided that it should be about books because we love books. So while we were having this conversation about what our podcast should be about, I happened to be reading this marvelous book by Anne Boyd Rioux, whom we interviewed for this episode. And her book is called Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Matters. And what she explained in that book is that Louisa May Alcott published the first half of Little Women in 1868. And then she published the second half in 1869. And then in 1881, her publisher got this great idea to put out a new edition. And this time around, he was going to clean it up. He was going to clean it up to make it more appropriate for proper young ladies. And that's the version that we've been reading almost ever since.
Yes, for basically a century or more, practically no one realized that the changes had been made until Norton, the publisher, recently went through and compared the original version with the one that survived and printed a list of changes in the appendix of the Norton Critical Edition of Little Women.
Yes, or until they read Anne's book, like I did,
and then
and discovered all of this.
Right. So we reached out to Anne, who's written a number of books involving American women writers, including Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, which was a huge success in its own right. It was an indie bestseller. It was chosen as a 2018 Best Book of the Year, or a book not to miss, by a number of different publications. Anne also edited the deluxe edition of Little Women for Penguin Classics. So we're so happy that she agreed to join us on the podcast.
Yes. So here she is discussing how very popular Little Women made Louisa May Alcott.
She was the J.K. Rowling of her day in terms of popularity and wealth.
It's amazing to let that sink in. Little Women was as popular in the 19th century as Harry Potter is today.
And not just for a few years, for decades, well after her death. People were still writing her fan letters because they didn't know.
She had died. Yeah.
Right. Well, the book was still so fresh, right? It still felt so real and so close. People didn't think of it as an old book necessarily. It felt like she lived on a bit longer, yeah.
Can you describe this 1881 version, how that came about and how that differs from the original version?
Roberts Brothers, they kept republishing the first two volumes, many reprintings, and 1881, they decided to put the two together and give it a pretty cover and to hire an illustrator, Frank Merrill, to do extensive illustrations throughout the book. And then also somebody, we don't know exactly how this happened, but the language of the book changed. They went through and made dozens, hundreds of little changes to the language.
Some of them are substantive. Can we talk about a couple of those examples?
Yeah.
Do you have some there? I brought some as well.
Yeah, I think the changes are significant. It changed the tone of the book.
Big time.
And it changed her voice.
Let's give some examples so people will understand. Let's do Marmee. But in the original, first description we get of her is she wasn't a particularly handsome person, but mothers are always lovely to their children. So not particularly handsome, but her kids love her. In the version we grew up on, she was not elegantly dressed, but a noble-looking woman.
Yeah.
That is substantively different.
It is. She's not Marmee anymore, is she?
No.
Yeah.
And not as interesting, I think, a description.
Well, she's not as real.
Yeah.
And I think actually the illustrations in that edition as well, the Frank Merrill illustrations, which are the classic illustrations. And Alcott loved them. She definitely approved of the illustrations, although she never commented on the textual changes. I think those images also take out the realness of the characters. They're like Gibson girls or something.
Yeah.
You know, they
and
have
the
little
clothes
pointy
are so
noses.
Refined and
And they're all like thin ladies with their beautiful Victorian dresses. And it doesn't, I think the changes in the text kind of mirror those illustrations in a way.
Yeah. Well, and then here's the first time we meet Laurie. Original version. Long nose, nice teeth, little hands and feet, tall as I am.
Meaning Joe, right?
Meaning Joe. He's only as tall as Joe, small hands and feet, nice teeth, long nose. What we read was handsome nose, fine teeth, small hands and feet, taller than I am.
So he gets taller.
That this male character has to be bigger. Joe gets smaller, Laurie gets bigger, and he's not as good looking in the original. He's better looking.
His nose was
in the
long and now
second
it's
one.
handsome.
Yeah.
We don't know who made the changes or if it was just one person. It seems most likely that Alcott was not involved. She was willing to let them change it, which is unfortunate because what they've done is they've made everybody more respectable.
Yes.
The language more respectable.
Yes.
And that edition was designed to make Little Women a classic so that you could put it on your shelf next to your Hawthorne and your Emerson and Thoreau.
But wasn't it already being treated that way? It was all. I mean, now we're getting ahead of ourselves.
It wasn't.
Okay.
That edition instigated a sort of uptick in sales. This book was a book that was meant to stay on your shelf and be there forever, an heirloom that you would pass down. And then the changes inside were meant to reflect this kind of elevation to a more respectable status, because the original book that she wrote is full of slang.
Full. Ain't is on at least every page.
Right.
You know, but I ain't Miss March versus but I am not Miss March. That's a
Right.
very different
They clean
voice.
up, right.
Or and all the slang I have, you know, I'll be as prim as a dish versus I'll be as prim as I can.
All the colloquialisms
All the
get
colloquially
smoothed
that are
out.
Yeah. And there were other things that I noticed. I think it's Joe says, you know, she was so upset about taking care of Aunt March.
Right,
and she says something about, I'll fly out the window or box her ears in the original. And then in the cleaned up version, fly out the window or cry. That is a character difference, right? That Joe in the original was going to punch her aunt in the face, basically.
Right.
And in the cleaned up version, she was going to weep.
Right.
You know,
yeah,
a radically different.
Right.
person.
So all of the girls, all the rough edges are smoothed off, right? It happens in terms of characterization, but also in the language that the narrator's using when she describes the girls. One of the girls sniffing at a flower becomes smelling a flower. And so
I
there's
have that one on my list.
Yeah, I thought that one was really interesting. Horrid becomes bad. Instead of the girls shouting, the girls are laughing. They come home at an earlier hour. All these things that are meant to make the girls a bit more refined, which isn't the March sisters. Louisa May Alcott was genteel middle class. She was very well educated. But she wanted to translate the real language that real girls were speaking onto the page. And that's what made it originally so popular, because the girls felt so real, right? You could just hear them speaking. And when you smooth off all those rough edges, they don't feel as real anymore.
And one of the complaints that you hear from people who don't like Little Women, because oddly enough, there are people who don't like Little Women,
Yeah, strange
is that
to
it's
believe,
too prim. And I wonder if everybody had been reading this version with the rougher language and the stronger characters, if people would have had the same objections.
Anne herself made an incredible discovery as she was doing research for her book. She realized that Louisa May Alcott originally wrote 2 big scenes one way and then changed them significantly before the final draft of the book. So Louisa May Alcott had a reputation for writing really quickly and never editing, which meant that Anne had assumed that the early drafts of these 2 manuscript chapters, which she knew she would be able to find at the Concord Free Public Library because they're stored there, she thought those 2 early drafts wouldn't be that interesting because Louisa May Alcott had this reputation for not changing anything. So Anne delayed going to look at them, but turns out she was wrong.
Dum, dum, dum. And just so everyone knows, the 2 chapters that we're talking about One of them was the chapter where Jo turns down Laurie's proposal of marriage, and the other is the chapter where Amy is writing letters home from Europe. Fred Vaughn is courting her, and she's decided she's going to accept his marriage proposal and make a very sensible marriage until, of course, she throws him over for Laurie.
Here's Anne describing the afternoon that she finally went to the Concord Library and sat down with those manuscript chapters.
It was one of those electric moments in the archive when I'm sitting there looking at them and comparing them to the printed version of the book. And on the back of one of the manuscript chapters, in Louise's hand, she has written, "Saved at mother's request." So these apparently were her mother's favorites. One of the chapters is substantially different. It's not just a few cosmetic changes.
And which chapter was that?
This was the Amy chapter. Well, in the original chapter, in the manuscript, this Captain Lennox guy gets off the boat and starts following her through Europe like a sad puppy dog, and he's the one who's going to propose to her. Fred Vaughn just disappears, and instead it's this guy, Captain Lennox, she picked up on the boat, who's wanting to propose to her, and these other men are serenading her who aren't even in the story. In other words, she's attracting a lot of male attention as she goes through Europe. She's not really able to turn it away. I think she talks about, I'm not flirting, I swear, that sort of thing. But she's having a gay old time. They even go to a casino and she sees women gambling and thinks it's, kind of exciting.
Wow, there was a casino
There was
scene.
a casino scene, yeah. So what she did, clearly, is she went through and tamed things down, gave her a more respectable suitor, right? Someone that the family knows.
And what about the Laurie chapter? How is that different?
That is almost exactly like the printed version, with one very interesting change. So they've had this long conversation where he's pleading with her and she's trying to let him down easily, and finally she just has to put her foot down and say, "Laurie, I'm not going to marry you." And he's devastated. Well, in the book, he runs off and says, "I'll be hanged, if I'll stand around and watch you fall in love with someone else," or whatever, right? He stomps off and he seems very upset. Well, in the manuscript, before he marches off, he grabs her and kisses her passionately.
Wow.
That was my moment in the archive where I was like, whoa.
There was
Laurie
a big...
forced himself on her, right?
Wow.
Yeah. He just had to have Jo. What he's doing is he's exhibiting his passion for her.
Yeah.
And he makes her see it and feel it. So he grabs her and he kisses her violently. Those are the exact words. You see where she's crossed it out. In the book, Jo is scared of his face. In the manuscript, it says Jo was scared of his passion. She crossed out passion and wrote in face. Just those two little changes, or maybe there's another one, but it's just those little changes. They're big, though. I think they're very big because, again, it shows her real awareness of the attraction between men and women, right? Yeah. And these girls are growing up, and these men are drawn to them physically, as in the Amy chapter 2, right? And the girls are having to negotiate these men's passions and their sexual interest in them.
Which, again, is lifelike. In deleting it, it becomes less lifelike.
Right.
We also talked with Anne about the wider impact of Little Women. The number of contemporary authors who credit the book with influencing their decision to become writers is astonishing. J.K. Rowling, whose nickname happens to be Jo, has said that it's hard to overstate what the Jo of Little Women meant to her. She says, quote, "A small, plain girl called Jo who had a hot temper and a burning ambition to be a writer."
The girls in Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet are obsessed with the book, Little Women, and they dream, like Jo, of writing a novel to escape their life of poverty. So obviously, the book has a global reach. And Ursula K. Le Guin, who's one of my favorite authors of all time. I love her.
I mean, who doesn't love
Who
her?
doesn't? If you haven't read The Wizard of Earthsea, forthwith, get the
Anon.
Anon. So she said, quote, "It may not seem much, but I don't know where else I or many other girls like me in my generation or my mother's or my daughter's were to find this model." She means of a girl dreaming of eventually becoming a writer. This validation.
I love that.
Me too.
We also talked about the popularity of the books with boys and men and its use in classrooms. So here's Anne discussing whether Little Women only appealed to girls.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence suggests that it wasn't just girls reading the book. When it first came out, it was such a sensation that everybody was reading it.
Didn't you say Teddy Roosevelt said it was one of his favorite books?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, he's really macho. He was really
He's a very
macho.
macho man.
He's a really manly guy.
My favorite male fan is John Green because he said once in an interview that he'd always loved Louisa May Alcott and didn't understand why she was an author just for girls. When the 1933 film was made with Katharine Hepburn, study guides of Little Women were sent by the National Council of Teachers of English to every single high school in the entire country. People grew up on it, not just girls. If you start looking at some of the data for what people are teaching in schools, what kids are reading, it starts to fall off by the 1880s. So when I started my research...
by the 1880s?
1980s. See, I live in the 19th century, so I make that slip sometimes. Yeah, 1980s. I naively thought when I started my research that I would love to meet some teachers who were teaching the book to kids. I was dismayed by the responses I got from teachers who told me, I would never teach Little Women. One of them said to me, literally, it's a private book for girls, not suitable for the public classroom. Well, it just goes to show you, I think, how much what pertains to women's lives in the domestic sphere has become separate from the public world. And this feeling that what goes on at home among women stays there. And as women have ventured out into the public sphere, right, they're supposed to leave all that stuff behind.
Can I interrupt for one moment?
Yeah.
Because I just want to make it crystal clear that Tom Sawyer came out 5 years after Little Women, is that right?
Yeah.
And so when we ask why are Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn still so important as literary novels and what made them groundbreaking, they were coming-of-age stories. They were realistic in their depiction of young people. They used vernacular language.
Yeah.
And all of that was true of Little Women 5 years earlier.
Yes. And Huck Finn wasn't until 1884, so 16 years later. Huck Finn is a book about race, too, and a book about slavery, big ideas. Putting them side by side, I think, is fascinating and interesting. But to me, it's almost more telling that Tom Sawyer is still around ubiquitously and Little Women isn't.
So there's no girlhood book being taught.
No, and there won't be until we really have a conversation as a culture about what our kids are reading in school. It's not just that girls need to see themselves represented in the text that they're reading in school. That's important, of course. But what's even more important to me is that boys are reading books about girls too, because reading is one of the most important ways that we learn to develop empathy for people who are different from us. In terms of the importance of reading across difference, a children's librarian told me that she's always giving kids books across lines of class difference, race difference, ethnicity, but she never thought about gender.
So is there hope for Little Women?
I do think there's hope for Little Women, and there's a new film that Greta Gerwig directed with an all-star cast, and I've seen it. It's fabulous. I think that this movie will introduce the book to a new generation because it has kind of fallen off the radar of a lot of girls. I mean, I gave it to my daughter when she turned 11. I wanted her to fall in love with Joe, and what I realized, and this was all while I was writing the book, she didn't need Joe in the same way that earlier generations of girls did, because she grew up with Hermione Granger. And she fell in love with Katniss Everdeen, and she was binge-watching Gilmore Girls and watching Rory grow up on TV. And I realized these are the Jo Marches of today for these young women. And they've lost touch with the original Jo March, and so I'm excited that this film is going to introduce her to them.
I know you reread all of the little, I'm going to call them the Little Women books.
Right.
Recently.
But Little Women, Little Men, and Joe's Boys.
Yes. What was that like? Do they hold up? I read them as a girl, but I haven't read them since. Do they have something to teach us, or do they feel kind of obsolete now?
I read them so many times growing up, I can't possibly count, but I hadn't read them since. And I was nervous about rereading them because there are plenty of books I've gone back to reread and they don't hold up. I'm thinking about you, Narnia Chronicles. But I am glad to say that I think, for me at least, they more than hold up. I adored going back and rereading them. I relished it. I loved living in that world again. I loved seeing the characters again. Some of the characters I love more today than I did then. They don't feel obsolete. They really don't feel obsolete.
Some of the characters you loved more. Who did you love more?
Beth. And I'll tell you why. I never really liked Beth all that much. She seemed too good to be true, perfect Beth. I didn't mourn her death the way I should have. And she always just annoyed me. Well, one of them...
been a joy as a child.
Sorry, Beth. One of the major revelations for me about Anne's book, Anne has a theory. Well, this is not her theory. The young women in Little Women were based on Louisa May Alcott's sisters. They were very much taken from life. And Beth was based on a sister of Louisa May Alcott who also, grew very ill and died, and with whom Louisa was very close. And Anne has a theory in her book that Louisa May Alcott's sister was anorexic. There are a lot of clues. The description of the actual sister's death, the description of her wasting away sounds very much like what happens with anorexia. And if you go back and you look at Little Women, there's so much food in the book and eating, and there are celebratory meals and times when they're hungry, but Beth never eats. When other people are eating, Beth, is off doing something else, checking on something, being with her kittens, whatever it is. And Beth is an incredibly anxious person. She's described as shy, but she is shy to the point that she has an anxiety disorder. She is truly afraid of being with other people, and she actively does not want to grow up. And so, having read Anne's book, when I went back to reread Little Women, I was reading it from the standpoint of, this is a young woman who is suffering from anorexia, and instead of being annoyed by her, I had so much sympathy for her, and I actually wept when she died, which I hadn't done when she was growing up. When I was growing up, rather.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And also, what I loved specifically about Little Women is it's this group of people, parents, children, grandparents, and they're all really flawed and they all make huge mistakes, but they are all deeply invested in helping each other be the best person they can be. And they come to each other and, Amy says, I'm vain. I know this is a part of my character I really want to work on. And it takes her years to get over it. But her family members, she annoys the hell out of them sometimes, but they also acknowledge her struggles and they want to support her struggles. And that's true of all the characters. And that was a beautiful thing to witness.
I've got to go reread this.
Right?
I can't continue to make this podcast. My list of books that I have to read is just growing exponentially.
I know. We should talk about that on a future episode. What to do about all the books we
100%.
Well, we are. Wait a minute. We have a whole episode.
What books should we read before we die? That's a great episode.
Yes. So that's it for this episode of the Book Dreams podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please do subscribe.
And please be sure to let us know if there's a book-related topic that you have wondered about. We'll try looking into it in a future episode. You can reach us for that reason or for any other reason at contact@bookdreamspodcast.com. We're also on Twitter at bookdreamspod and on Instagram at bookdreamspodcast. You can find Anne Boyd Rioux, whose last name, by the way, is spelled Rioux, on Twitter at Anne Boyd Rioux, or on Facebook as @Anne Boyd Rioux Author.
Many thanks to our associate producer, Gianfranco Lentini, and to our theme music composer, Maya Polsky. You can find me at eveyohalem.com and Julie at juliesternberg.com. And don't forget, if you like the podcast and think someone else would too, please rate and review us in iTunes or Stitcher.
Until next time, happy book dreaming.
Listen to Book Dreams with Julie and